When former Navy mechanic Frank Mulligan bought an abandoned round stone house from 1963, he thought it was just another crumbling relic in Oregon's hills. But when his German Shepherd Ranger began clawing at the spiral stone floor, the ground answered back with hollow echoes, hidden metal, and a secret sealed since the Cold War. If stories like this speak to you, hit like and subscribe and tell me, would you have opened that hatch? The train cut across Oregon's Gray Plains, a silver scar in the dusk. When it stopped, the world seemed to exhale. Frank Mulligan stepped off the last car duffel slung over his shoulder and stood still for a long moment on the empty platform. The wind came sharp off the Cascades, bringing with it the smell of pine-old rain and distance. When his boots hit the wooden planks with the same slow weight as the years he'd carried 20 in the Navy 3, learning how to live without orders. Civilians thought freedom was easy. They'd never had to earn it the way soldiers did. Frank rubbed the scar that trailed down his neck hidden beneath his collar, the one Ranger used to sniff when nightmares woke them both. The dog had learned that the only way to keep Frank calm was to lay a paw on his chest until his heart slowed. Tonight, Ranger waited in the borrowed pickup truck, his muzzle pressed to the window, watching every move. "We're home, buddy," Frank murmured, though the word tasted foreign. Home. It hadn't felt like that anywhere since 2008. The road to the property was half forgotten, two narrow lanes winding through the forest until they opened on a clearing. There it stood, the round stone house built in 1963 by a naval architect named James Whitlock. Frank had read about him in the sale papers, a captain who left the service and disappeared before he could explain why he built a fortress of granite in the middle of nowhere. Local rumor said he'd gone mad. Others said the government had made him vanish. The house looked like it could keep secrets. Its smooth gray walls curved like the hull of an inverted ship. The roof, a perfect dome of glass now half clouded with moss, caught the last of the fading light. The front door was iron cold and unwelcoming, but when Frank pushed it open, the hinges groaned as if remembering. The air inside was thick with oil and dust. His footsteps echoed as if the house repeated every move. Ranger padded in after him, sniffing along the floor, his nails clicking against the stone. When he barked, once the echo answered like a dozen dogs trapped beneath the ground. Frank frowned. The acoustics were wrong too perfect. "Guess they weren't lying, huh?" he muttered. "The house listens." He made a half laugh that died too soon. He didn't believe in ghosts, only memory, and this house had too much of it. Upstairs, dust cloaked the furniture in ghostly white. A rotary phone still sat on a desk by the window, disconnected but somehow humming faintly when he touched it. He unpacked his duffel, set down a framed photo of a younger man in uniform, his father Robert Mulligan missing in action since 1963, the same year this house was built. Frank had stopped asking questions about that long ago, but now, in this silence, they crept back uninvited. He looked around unease, prickling under his skin. He served under the same fleet, he whispered. The same damn year. Ranger huffed as if reminding him to breathe. Night came quick in the hills. Rain started slow at first, then hard enough to rattle the dome. Frank sat on the couch, the old Navy blanket over his knees, Ranger's head resting there. Outside, thunder rolled in lazy waves. The house seemed to absorb it, turning thunder into whispers that circled the walls. It was the strangest kind of quiet one that wasn't empty, but listening. He poured a shot of bourbon, stared into it, and said, "To the ghosts who never made it home." Ranger's ears flicked, then lowered again. They sat like that for an hour, two survivors who didn't know what they'd survived for. At midnight, the storm eased. A single drip echoed from somewhere beneath the floor, too steady to be rain. Frank tilted his head, listening. The sound came again, one drop, pause, another. Ranger stood alert, gaze fixed on the center of the room. His ears twitched. Frank frowned. The dog didn't growl. He simply stared at the floor as though it were breathing. Then quietly he sat down. His tail curled to close eyes, never leaving that spot. "It's just water," Frank said, though his own voice sounded unsure. The house didn't answer, but the drip did this time, closer, sharper, almost metallic. Frank's stomach tightened. He took another drink, the burn grounding him. "We'll check tomorrow," he muttered. But even as he said it, he knew the house wouldn't let him wait that long. He turned off the lamp, the glow dying slow across the stone walls. The dark came alive with faint sounds, the wind, the creak of metal, the slow exhale of a place remembering what it was built for. Frank lay back on the couch, eyes on the dome above where lightning flared one last time and lit the ceiling in a pulse of white. Ranger moved closer, laying his head on Frank's chest the way he always did. The man closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come. Somewhere beneath the floor, the house sighed, or maybe it was the earth. Either way, it sounded like a warning. The next evening settled over the hills like a low tide, the kind that swallowed every sound until only the hum of the earth remained. Inside the round stone house, the fire in the small iron stove flickered weakly, throwing long shadows that bent with the curve of the walls. He sat at the table with a cold coffee and an open map pretending to focus while Ranger lay nearby watching. The storm from the night before had passed, but its damp breath lingered in the house, seeping into the walls and floor. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and the sound echoed oddly inside, bending back on itself like it had gotten lost in the circular acoustics. Frank looked up, listening. The echo didn't fade. It circled once, then twice, until Ranger's ears twitched sharply. The dog stood tail-stiff, muscles tight. He began pacing across the center of the room, nose close to the floor, tracing invisible rings as though scenting something that shouldn't exist. Frank watched, confused. "What's up, boy?" he asked, his voice breaking the quiet too. Suddenly. Ranger didn't answer, of course. He just stopped at the middle of the spiral-shaped stone floor, the very center of the house. He tilted his head, ears pricked, and gave a short, uncertain bark. The sound bounced off the walls and came back, multiplied a dozen barks, folding over one another. It startled Frank more than it should have. He stood, boots scuffing against the stone. "Easy," he murmured. But Ranger wasn't restless for nothing. The dog stepped in a slow circle, claws clicking on the floor's pattern, and then pressed his paw against one of the stones, a darker one, almost imperceptibly lower than the rest. When his paw hit it, the sound was wrong. Hollow. Frank frowned, crouched down, and tapped his knuckle against the same spot. The echo that came back wasn't the dull thud of rock. It was sharper, deeper, the sound of metal beneath stone. He tapped again, this time harder. The same metallic hum returned, faint but undeniable. "You've got to be kidding," he whispered under his breath. He pressed his ear to the cold floor, half expecting to hear nothing but the whisper of his own heartbeat, but the sound that came through was real. A low, distant vibration, like air moving through a narrow space. Maybe an old pipe, maybe something else. Either way, it came from below. Ranger gave a small whine, stepping back, eyes locked on the same spot. His tail flicked nervously, neither raised in alert nor tucked in fear, something in between. Frank sat back on his heels and rubbed a hand over his face. The last thing he needed was a house with problems buried under it. "It's just air," he said quietly, as if trying to convince himself. Old foundation, nothing more. But when he said it, the air shifted. A draft crept through the room, cool and dry, brushing past his cheek before vanishing. He looked around, confused. Every window was shut, every vent sealed, yet the breeze had come from below. He leaned close to the floor again. The spiral design he hadn't paid much attention before was perfectly aligned, the stones narrowing in pattern toward the exact spot where Ranger now sat like a statue. He reached out, tracing one of the grooves with his fingers. The edges were smooth, too deliberate to be accidental, too precise to be merely decorative. The floor was a design with intention, not aesthetics. It was a mechanism. Frank felt a chill creep up his arms, though the fire was still burning behind him. Ranger gave a low huff, stepped back and looked at him as if to say, "You hear it now, don't you?" Frank almost laughed. "You've been watching too many ghost shows, buddy." His voice was steady, but his pulse wasn't. He stood and walked to the stove, tossed another log onto the embers, the flames flaring briefly before settling into a steady crackle. The warmth helped, but the unease didn't fade. When he turned around, Ranger was still at the center of the room, sitting perfectly still, ears forward, eyes focused on the floor like he was waiting for something to rise out of it. Frank sighed, ran a hand through his hair, and crouched again beside the dog. The stone beneath them was cold, unnaturally cold compared to the rest of the floor. He placed his palm flat on it, expecting to feel solid ground, but beneath the surface there was the faintest vibration, like a machine, long asleep trying to breathe again. He pulled his hand back quickly. Ranger gave a low rumble of agreement. "All right," Frank said softly. "We'll look tomorrow." He stood, grabbed his coat, and headed toward the small bedroom, but halfway down the hall he stopped. Behind him, from somewhere deep within the stone, came a noise like a single drop of water falling into a metal basin. Ping. Then silence. He turned, eyes narrowing, but Ranger was already there, standing at the edge of the living room, head low, staring into the dark. The dog's breath fogged in the cold air rising from the cracks. Frank didn't move. The house seemed to hold its breath with them. Outside, the wind scraped through the trees, the sound mingling with the faintest whisper that could have been pipes or could have been something else entirely. Whatever it was, it came from under their feet, waiting a long time to be heard. A week passed, and the rhythm of the Oregon rain became the rhythm of Frank's days. The sky stayed low, pressed close to the earth, and the forest that surrounded the stone house looked half drowned, its branches glistening like black glass. Frank tried to live simply coffee at dawn repairs by noon-long walks with Ranger down the gravel path that led to nowhere, but every night the house spoke in small ways. The soft hiss of air through cracks, the faint vibration beneath his boots, the hollow echo that never quite left his ears. He told himself the noise was foundation settling water pipes, anything but what it felt like a heartbeat. That night the rain came heavier than before, hammering the dome so loud it drowned out his thoughts. Lightning flared across the curved glass above the living room, flashing silver light over the spiral floor. Ranger sat at the center, again motionless. Gaze locked on the same stones that had bothered him since the first night. When thunder rolled, he barked once sharp and commanding, then began to dig at the cracks between the stone's paws, scraping until sparks of grit flew. "Ranger, stop," Frank said, setting down his mug, but the dog only looked up once as if to say he couldn't. Frank sighed, grabbed the flashlight, and knelt beside him. The light revealed what the dim lamps hadn't, the faint circular seam etched perfectly into the stone pattern, a ring within the spiral, subtle as breath. He tapped it with the butt of the flashlight. The tap came back not as rock, but hollow metal. He struck again, slower this time. Even the rain seemed to pause. Beneath that floor was space. "You've got to be kidding," Frank muttered under his breath, though not in anger, more in disbelief. He brushed away dust with his sleeve and felt the texture shift. The center stone wasn't mortar and slate, like the rest, but sealed over with something smoother, a thin crust of hardened resin. He found a chisel in the old toolbox left by the previous owner and worked the edge into the seam. The resin cracked softly like ice breaking on a frozen lake. A puff of cold air escaped, faint but undeniable. Ranger whined, taking a step back. "Easy, boy," Frank whispered. He pulled harder, and the stone gave way. Beneath it lay a round steel hatch, dull with age, but intact its center embossed with a worn insignia, an eagle clutching an anchor, the faint letters U.S. Navy circling its edge. The sight froze him. For a long minute he didn't move. The thunder outside rolled again, the sound crawling along the metal beneath him, resonating in his bones. He reached down, brushed away the grime, and found a latch, corroded but functional. He hesitated, palm resting on the cold steel. He'd opened many hatches before, but never one on land. 60 years, he whispered. Whatever's down there, it's been waiting that long. Ranger shifted the sound of his claws soft against the stone, his breathing loud in the still air. Frank flicked on the flashlight again and turned the latch. It resisted, then gave with a heavy sigh. A burst of cold air rose from below, carrying the smell of metal oil and something else, time itself, sealed too long. He pulled the hatch open wide enough to shine the light inside. The beam sliced through the dark and met walls of curved metal, riveted and painted gray, a perfect circle, descending like a miniature ship's hull buried beneath the house. A ladder led down into the hollow. Frank crouched, shining the light along the floor of the chamber below. There was no debris, no dust, only stillness. In the center stood a wooden crate, large and rectangular, its edges reinforced with brass and stenciled with words that made his throat go dry. Property of U.S. Navy, 1954. For a moment, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. He ran a hand across the edge of the hatch, fingers trembling against the chill. The steel was real. The engraving was real. He wasn't dreaming. "What the hell were you building, Captain Whitlock?" he murmured. Ranger stood at the lip of the opening, staring down, body tense but silent. No bark, no growl. The dog's ears tilted forward and his breathing slowed. It was as if the animal recognized something sacred or dangerous. Frank's own heart thudded unevenly. The house had been built over this deliberately. Every curve of the walls, every line of the spiral floor, all of it pointed to this center, this hatch. This wasn't a coincidence, it was design. He shined the light deeper into the chamber, catching the faint reflection of brass fixtures, metal shelves bolted to the circular wall, maybe old instruments or controls. The smell rising from below was sharp and sterile, like sealed air finally escaping after decades of silence. He could almost feel the change in pressure, a faint suction as the hidden room exhaled. Ranger's tail lowered. He let out a quiet sound that wasn't fear exactly, but the instinct of knowing something unnatural had just awakened. Frank swallowed, forcing his voice steady. "All right, old boy," he whispered. "Guess we're not the first sailors to crawl into the dark." He grabbed the rope from the toolkit, tied it to a beam, and looked once more into the hole. The light shimmered off the crate below its stenciled letters, glowing faintly like a name called from another lifetime. He reached for the ladder boot, slipping slightly against the rim of the hatch, then steadied himself with one last glance towards Ranger. "Stay," he said quietly. Ranger didn't move. The dog stood at the edge, silent and unwavering, amber eyes fixed on his owner, as Frank took his first step into the hollow, vanishing into the cold breath of the house that remembered. The air inside the chamber pressed cold against Frank's skin, thick with the metallic scent of sealed years. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sliding across riveted steel and settling on the wooden crate in the center. Dust drifted through the light like faint smoke, disturbed by his breath. Each step on the ladder groaned under his weight, echoing softly against the walls. When his boots touched the floor, the sound rang hollow as though the room itself had a heartbeat. He crouched by the crate, running his hand over its rough surface. The wood was dry, but not rotted, a strange kind of preservation, as if the air had been drained of time. The stenciled words, "Property of U.S. Navy." 1954 stood firm, the black ink faded but legible. His fingers brushed the metal clasps, corroded yet intact. He hesitated. Ranger was still above silent, except for the faint scrape of his claws against stone, watching from the lip of the hatch. "It's all right," Frank called softly. "Just a look." He unlatched the first clasp. It squealed, and a small puff of cold air escaped, carrying with it the ghost of oil and seawater. The second clasp resisted before giving way. He lifted the lid. His flashlight struck something that gleamed nearly 24 dull gold bars stacked in neat rows, each stamped with serial numbers and tiny Navy seals. He'd seen gold before, but never like this, untouched and sleeping beneath his feet for half a century. The gold wasn't the polished kind. It was raw utilitarian, the sort used for transport or reserve, not display. He felt the weight of history more than the lure of wealth. He reached for one, the metal cold enough to burn, and turned it toward the light. Beneath the bars lay something different, a single envelope, thick and sealed with a faded red wax stamp. His name wasn't on it, but his instincts whispered that it was meant for whoever dared open the crate. He hesitated again, thumb resting on the edge of the wax. Above him, Ranger let out a low, uneasy whine. "I know," Frank murmured. "Me too." He broke the seal carefully, trying not to tear the paper. Inside was a folded sheet, yellowed but crisp, written in a hand that was both deliberate and tired. The first line stopped him cold. "If you're reading this, it means I failed to return." He He stared at the words, the letters leaning slightly to the right. Firm strokes that carried the precision of an officer. He read on, voice barely a whisper in the hollow room. This gold was meant for a project I could not obey. I secured it in 1954, and when the pressure from command grew intolerable in 1963, I built this stone house over the vault to keep it away from those who would trade souls for weapons. If you have found this, it is your turn to choose. His breath caught. The letter was signed simply James Whitlock, Captain, U.S. Navy. Frank read it twice, then a third time, until the words began to feel like whispers rather than ink. He could almost hear the voice behind them, calm, resolved, haunted. The kind of voice a man uses when he's accepted that he will not come home. He looked back at the crate. The gold wasn't just currency, it was evidence. Evidence of something buried not just physically but morally. Ranger's head appeared at the hatch above amber eyes, catching the light. The dog's gaze was steady, not fearful, almost understanding. Frank folded the letter carefully, sliding it back into its envelope. He sat down on the cold metal floor back against the curved wall and stared at the crate. The storm outside was still raging, but down here the sound was distant, softened by layers of earth and stone. He thought about Captain Whitlock, why he built this house, why he sealed himself into silence. The man had been a sailor like his own father, bound by duty and conscience. Whatever this gold had been meant for, Whitlock had chosen disobedience over obedience, conscience over command. Frank could almost respect that. Yet the question pressed harder than admiration: what project had he refused to obey? And why leave this message for someone else to finish? The house above creaked faintly, the sound echoing down through the hatch like a breath. Ranger barked once, short and low, not warning but acknowledgement. Frank looked up at him, the corners of his mouth tightening into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Yeah," he said softly, "I guess it's our turn." He turned the flashlight again toward the rest of the chamber, following the beam across the walls. There were markings, numbers, small notes scrawled in grease pencil along the metal. Some he recognized from old Navy maintenance codes, others unfamiliar. He leaned closer to one, Vault Integrity 12, 63. December 1963. The same year his father's ship vanished. His stomach tightened. The connection felt too close to coincidence. He traced the line with his fingertips, the chalky residue flaking away beneath his skin. "What were you guarding, Captain?" he whispered. The words dissolved into the silence, swallowed by the cold. He tucked the envelope into his jacket pocket, one last look at the gold before lowering the lid. As it shut, the dull thud echoed up through the house, traveling through every stone, every seam. Ranger's ears twitched. The dog backed a step from the hatch head, turning toward the far wall as though he'd heard something else. A faint hollow knock from behind the stone. Frank froze, eyes flicking to the ceiling. The sound came again, soft but deliberate, from somewhere deeper in the structure. He held his breath, listening. The third knock was slower, heavier, as if something or someone was answering. The knocks faded into the walls and left Frank standing in that small steel room, every nerve tuned to the kind of silence that followed danger. He waited, holding his breath, but the sound didn't return. Ranger's ears were still pricked toward the far corner of the living room, above his whole body, a coiled question. "It's okay," Frank whispered up through the hatch, though he didn't believe it. He climbed the ladder, closed the hatch, and covered it with the stone again, his hands shaking as he pressed the edges back into place. The night passed in fragments of sleep, each one broken by the echo of that letter in his head, "Your turn to choose." By morning, the storm had drained away, leaving a flat white sky and a house that felt different, heavier somehow, as if its secret had shifted closer to the surface. Frank moved through the rooms with new eyes. The place wasn't random. Every line, every curve of the wall had intention. Captain Whitlock hadn't built a home, he'd built a vault. When he reached the far side of the living room where the stone met the wooden beams, something caught his attention, a hollow note beneath his knuckles when he rapped against the wall. He knocked again. Hollow, definitely. He pried away a loose board, and behind it, a thin layer of plaster crumbled to reveal a cavity about the width of his arm. Inside, something metallic glinted in the flashlight beam, a copper tube capped at both ends. He pulled it out carefully, wiped off decades of grime, and unscrewed one end. A roll of microfilm slid out, wrapped tight along with a thin folder sealed in waxed paper. The smell of old paper hit him immediately, dry, chemical, the scent of history. He spread the contents across the table, Ranger settling at his feet. The first sheet was an official document typed and signed in elegant ink. The heading read, Department of Naval Procurement Private Asset Agreement. The signature at the bottom belonged to a man named Arthur Lennox. The date, March 1954. Frank leaned closer, reading slowly. Lennox was described as an industrial magnate who had temporarily transferred gold reserves to support classified defense initiatives. His estate, according to the document, was to reclaim the assets upon project completion. But one clause near the bottom froze Frank mid-sentence. In the event of no surviving heirs, the appointed custodian is authorized to dedicate said assets to veterans or humanitarian causes. He exhaled hard, reading the line twice. Custodian. That had to be Whitlock. The gold in the crate wasn't stolen, it had been held in trust. Ranger raised his head at the sound of Frank's voice. He wasn't hiding it for himself, Frank said softly. He was keeping it safe. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, a quiet punctuation of agreement. He fed the microfilm through the old Navy reader Whitlock had kept it for this purpose. The film crackled to life under the dim light images of typed reports sliding across the small screen. Financial ledger's shipment manifests communication logs between the Navy and the Lennox estate. Most of it routine until he came to a reel marked MIA Records Fleet 47. He almost skipped it, thinking it unrelated, but the name Whitlock in the margin made him stop. The document listed 18 crew members declared missing in action December 1963. The date hit him like a strike to the chest. His pulse quickened as he read down the list line by line until his eyes stopped at the last name Robert Mulligan. He froze. For a long moment he couldn't breathe. His father's name was there, typed cleanly, the letters black against white, a life reduced to a line on a forgotten record. His throat tightened. He leaned closer to make sure same ship, same date. His father had served under Captain Whitlock. That meant the man who built this house had known him, maybe even buried his memory here along with the gold. Frank sat back, the chair creaking under his weight. The room tilted in the quiet. He pressed his palms against his eyes until colors bloomed behind them. "You knew him," he whispered to the air, to the house, to whoever was listening. "You knew my father." Ranger whined softly, resting his chin on Frank's knee. He looked down at the dog, grateful for the solid weight of him. "He's been gone 60 years, Frank said. But maybe he's been here the whole time." He looked again at the ledger, at the list of men who had vanished under Whitlock's command. The thought pressed in, what if Whitlock's disobedience, the project he refused to complete, had cost those lives? What if hiding the gold wasn't just about morality, but guilt? His hand found the envelope still tucked in his jacket pocket. He unfolded the letter once more, letting his eyes trace Whitlock's steady handwriting. "It is your turn to choose. Choose what? Expose it. Protect it. Redeem it." The answer slipped through his fingers like sand. Outside, wind brushed against the walls, carrying with it the faint creak of branches. The house moaned in reply, a long, low sound like something deep within it shifting. Ranger lifted his head again, ears pricking toward the far corner of the room, the same one that had echoed before. Frank turned slowly, following the dog's gaze. The hollow wall stretched along that side, the plaster cracked in faint lines. The copper tube had come from there, but the space behind it was larger than he'd thought. He stood heart-thudding and pressed his palm flat against the wall. The vibration came faintly through his skin, not from outside, but from within. The same heartbeat as before, pulsing quietly through the stone. He stepped back, the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. "You built this to keep something safe," he murmured to the empty air. "But what else did you bury with it?" Captain Ranger's gaze stayed fixed unblinking on that wall as if he already knew the answer. By morning, the sky above the ridge turned the color of old pewter, the kind of light that made the world look half-frozen. Frank loaded the documents, the microfilm, and the folded letter into an old briefcase, its leather cracked, but strong, the same one he'd carried through deployments years ago. Ranger hopped into the passenger seat of the pickup, nails tapping against the dashboard, tail flicking once, as if he knew this trip mattered. The drive to town was long and quiet. The radio barely worked, only static and whispers of old country songs fading between valleys. The road curved along the Columbia River, the trees still slick from last night's rain. Frank's thoughts tangled with every mile gold that wasn't stolen, a captain who confessed a father listed as missing under the same command. It felt less like discovery and more like inheritance, something he hadn't asked for but couldn't turn away from. When he pulled into the small law office off Main Street, the sign above the door was so faded it was barely legible: Parker and Wells, attorneys at law. The bell jingled as he entered the office, thick with the dust, coffee, and time. Behind a cluttered desk sat Henry Parker, gray-haired, thick glasses sliding down his nose, a tie loosened around his neck. He looked up, squinting through the haze of cigarette smoke. "Well, I'll be damned," he said with a rasp. "Hey, Frank Mulligan. I heard you'd gone quiet up in the hills." Frank gave a faint smile. "Guess I found something that didn't want to stay quiet." He placed the briefcase on the desk and opened it. One by one, he laid out the papers, the contract signed by Arthur Lennox, the ledger, pages the microfilm scans. Parker leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, eyes narrowing as he read. His brow furrowed deeper with every line. Only the rustle of pages and Parker's lighter broke the silence. When he finally spoke, his voice carried both wonder and weight. "If this is real," he said slowly, "then what you've got in your hands isn't just gold, it's history, and not the kind the government likes to talk about." Frank leaned against the edge of the desk, arms folded. "I don't want to make headlines. I just want to do what's right." Parker nodded, tapping the end of his cigarette into a tray shaped like a ship's wheel. "Then we've got to figure out what right means." He reached for the Lennox agreement, running a finger along the key clause. "Here," he said. "See this line? If the Lennox estate has no heirs, custodian is authorized to dedicate assets to veterans or humanitarian causes. That's your anchor. Legally, the ownership reverts to the custodian's discretion. Whitlock was that custodian. And when he died, he didn't assign a successor, so the responsibility passes to whoever takes possession. That's me," Frank said quietly. Parker nodded again. "That's you." He sat back, the chair creaking beneath him. "Now, if you were to claim it for yourself, the Treasury would come down on you like a hammer. But if you're talking about distributing it funds for rehab programs, housing for veterans, medical aid, then you're not stealing. You're fulfilling an unexecuted will, an obligation trapped in time." Frank exhaled slowly, his hands on his knees. "So it wouldn't be a crime," Parker gave a small, humorless smile. "Not if we document that you are executing the donor's original humanitarian clause, and we notify the right veteran foundations first. The law has its gray places, Frank, but paper makes them lighter. Sometimes the line between right and legal depends on who's reading the paperwork." He pushed the folder back across the desk. "This one reads clear enough to me. The gold doesn't belong to the government anymore. The donor's gone. The Navy's claim expired decades ago. Whitlock did his duty. He protected it until someone else could finish what he started." Ranger, lying near Frank's boots, let out a quiet sigh, his tail brushing the floor once before going still again. Frank looked down at him, then back at Parker. "What if someone comes looking?" he asked. "What if the government, or someone worse, decides they want it back?" Parker's eyes softened, though his tone stayed firm. "Then you do what soldiers always do. You hold the line. The captain passed the choice to you, son. You either stay silent and let the truth rot in that stone house, or you make it mean something again." Frank stared at the papers, the typed words blurring slightly, as he thought about his father's name on that list, about Whitlock's letter about the meaning of duty when no one's left to enforce it. He rubbed his thumb over the edge of the page. "You fought in Korea, didn't you?" he asked quietly. Parker nodded. Fought Bled came home and wondered what it was all for. You know the drill. Then you know. Frank said, voice low, how heavy it feels when the people who gave their lives end up as a footnote. Parker's gaze held his for a long moment. I do, he said simply. So, if you got a chance to write them back into history, do it. The room fell silent except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan. Frank looked at Ranger, who was watching him with that steady, loyal gaze, the kind that never asked questions, only waited for orders. He nodded to himself slowly. All right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Let's finish what they couldn't. Parker leaned forward, stubbed out his cigarette, and said, Then let's start with keeping you alive long enough to do it. By the time Frank drove back up the hill that evening, the weather had turned. He had barely left Parker's office when he noticed a dark sedan idling across the street, the kind that never belonged to locals. The kind of rain that felt personal had rolled in steady and cold. It drummed against the windshield like a reminder that peace never lasts long. The house rose from the fog like something half-remembered, its round stone walls beaded with silver water. Ranger barked once when Frank opened the door tail, flicking nervously before settling near the hearth. Frank had barely hung his coat when he heard the knock. 3 slow raps, heavy certain. A tall man stood in the rain-gray suit, immaculate despite the downpour smile fixed in the polished way of boardrooms. Mr. Mulligan, he asked, voice smooth as oil. Frank nodded, keeping his hand on the doorframe. You've got me at a disadvantage, the man extended a gloved hand that Frank didn't take. Howard Ellis, Apex Heritage Group. We are an acquisitions firm handling legacy properties and estates of historical value. I believe you've recently taken possession of a rather exceptional one. The pause between words was deliberate, baited. Frank kept his tone neutral. The place was for sale, I bought it. Didn't know it came with visitors. Ellis's smile didn't falter. It also came with history, Mr. Mulligan, and records show certain items belonging to the Lennox estate were never properly transferred. Our firm represents the archival interest of those materials. He pulled a folded paper from his coat, kept it tucked against his palm the way people do when what's written isn't the point. It's the intimidation behind it that matters. That gold, he said softly, belongs to history. Rain hissed around them, water running in silver ribbons off the eaves. Frank studied the man's face. His eyes were cold, precise, the kind that measured everything and felt nothing. History's been wrong before, Frank said quietly. Ellis's smile twitched but held. Perhaps. But history also favors those who control the narrative. He looked past Frank into the dim room behind him, taking in the shadowed furniture the shape of Ranger by the fireplace. This house was never meant for habitation. It was built for custody. I suggest you remember that. You're trespassing, Frank said, voice low but steady. If you want something from me, you can come back with a warrant. Ellis tucked the paper back into his coat. Oh, we'll be back, he said softly. One way or another, that gold won't stay buried. He tipped his umbrella, turned, and walked down the path, shoes making no sound against the gravel despite the rain. Frank watched until the gray car disappeared into the fog. For a long while, he didn't move. Ranger came to stand beside him, tail still nose twitching toward the road as if memorizing the man's scent. Yeah, Frank murmured. Didn't like him either. He locked the door, checked the windows twice, and poured himself a cup of black coffee that went cold before he drank it. The storm outside thickened wind curling around the dome of the house like hands pressing in. The power flickered twice, then held. Ranger paced the floor in slow arcs, restless nose to the baseboards, ears tuned to something Frank couldn't hear. Easy boy, Frank said, setting down his mug. He's gone. But the dog didn't settle. Every few seconds he'd glance toward the back door, growling low in his throat. Hours passed. Midnight crept in without notice. Frank tried to read, but the words blurred. When the noise came, it wasn't loud, a faint scrape metal against wood from the back porch. Ranger lifted his head muscles, tightening. Another sound followed, softer this time, a whisper of air as if the door frame shifted. Then the click, the lock. Ranger's growl deepened. Frank was on his feet before his mind caught up, reaching for the flashlight and the iron wrench near the counter. The next sound was sharper, a hinge straining the edge of the door, creaking inward. "Hey!" Frank barked, stepping forward, but Ranger was already moving, a blur of muscle and instinct. The door burst open, cold air flooding in with rain and the smell of wet earth. A figure darted back into the dark shadow, swallowed by storm. Ranger lunged, his snarl swallowed by thunderpaws splashing through puddles outside. Ranger Frank shouted, rushing after him, beam cutting through sheets of rain. He caught movement by the trees, a scuffle, a shout muffled by wind, and then silence. Frank's chest burned as he reached the yard. The only sound left was the rain and his own pulse. "Ranger," he called again, but the forest gave no answer. Then came the sound, soft, broken paws on gravel. Ranger limped from the darkness, wet and trembling fur streaked with mud. In his mouth, he carried something that clinked faintly when it hit the porch, a gold bar, edges dented, one corner smeared with blood, his blood. Frank knelt, heart twisting. He pressed a hand to the dog's shoulder, felt the tremor under his skin. "You did good," he whispered, voice rough. Ranger laid his head against Frank's knee, eyes bright even in pain. Frank looked toward the trees, the rain now falling quieter, slower, as though listening. Someone had come for the gold, and they weren't finished. He knew Ellis would return with something sharper than a polite knock, and the only shield he had was to make the secret worthless as leverage. The rain didn't stop for 3 days. It drummed against the stone roof like time itself, demanding an answer. Frank sat at the kitchen table, Ranger lying beside him with his bandaged legs stretched out, both of them framed in the dull gray light of morning. The gold bar from the break-in lay on the table, its surface scarred, the blood wiped clean but not forgotten. Frank stared at it for a long time, his reflection warped across the metal. Every choice he'd avoided now sat silent before him. He knew what Ellis and his kind wanted: to bury the truth under legal ink and corporate silence, to turn men like his father into ghosts no one remembered. But the captain's words still rang in his mind. "It is your turn to choose." The world above the hatch had changed since 1954, but the kind of men who buried truth hadn't. He stood slowly, the weight in his chest shifting from confusion to certainty. "We're done hiding, Ranger," he said. The dog raised his head. Amber eyes following him as he pulled the old camera from the shelf, set it on the table, and turned it on. The red light blinked once. Frank straightened his back the way he used to before a briefing. His voice was calm when he spoke. "My name is Frank Mulligan. This house belonged to Captain James Whitlock of the United States Navy. 60 years ago, he hid government gold here, not to steal it, but to protect it. That gold was meant for a weapons program that never should have existed. Men died to keep it secret. One of them was my father, Robert Mulligan." He paused, breath steady. "If you're hearing this, it means I've decided to do what Captain Whitlock couldn't finish. I'm giving it back to the ones who were forgotten." He reached for the envelope on the table, lifted Whitlock's letter, and held it up to the camera. "He didn't betray his country," Frank said softly. "He saved its soul." Ranger let out a quiet sound, almost like approval. Frank turned off the camera, copied the files from the microfilm, and sealed everything into a weatherproof drive. He packed it with the letter, the scanned documents, and photographs of the gold. When the clouds broke the next morning, he drove into town with Ranger in the passenger seat, the truck bed carrying 18 small boxes, each lined with 1 bar of gold and a copy of Whitlock's note. The air smelled of wet pine. His first stop was the post office. The clerk, a young woman who looked too tired for her age, raised her eyebrows when she saw the labels, each addressed to a name, followed by family of, and the towns stretched across the country. Frank handed her the stack one at a time, his voice quiet but firm. "These go certified," he said. "Every one of them matters." When he walked back outside, the clouds had lifted enough to show a line of light cutting through the sky. He looked down at Ranger. "That's one thing done," he said. The dog wagged his tail once, also and steady. Over the next days, Frank drove to Portland, then Seattle, visiting local news stations and veterans' offices. He left identical envelopes with them all his confession video, the Lennox Agreement, the proof of where the gold came from and why it was hidden. Some refused to believe him. Others just stared speechless at the evidence. It didn't matter. The truth had a way of echoing once released. By the time he returned to the Stone House, fatigue had settled deep in his bones, but it was the kind that came with purpose. He found an email waiting in his inbox from the widow of one of the sailors on the missing list. She wrote in shaky sentences that her grandson had found the package. She had opened it, slowly trembling hands unfolding the letter from Whitlock, reading each word aloud. She had believed for 60 years that her husband had been part of a scandal branded a deserter erased from the record. Her message ended simply, "He didn't steal from my husband. He saved him." Frank read it twice, blinking hard before closing the screen. He stepped outside into the clearing dusk, the air sharp with pine. The house stood silent but no longer heavy. It wasn't a tomb anymore, it was a promise kept. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the last bar of gold, the one he had kept for himself, not his wealth, but his foundation. He placed it on the porch rail where the sun caught it and turned it to amber light. "You'll build again," he whispered, "something worth the men who never came home." Ranger leaned against his leg tail, brushing his jeans. Frank scratched behind his ears, looking out over the ridge where the mist rolled in gentle waves. "Guess that's our mission, huh?" he murmured. The dog's eyes followed his gaze, calm and steady. Somewhere down the valley, thunder rolled faintly, not threat but memory. Frank turned back toward the house, gold glinting behind him like the past, finally at peace. A year changed everything. The round stone house, once cold and hollow, now pulsed with the sound of life. Hammers echoed against the walls where silence had once ruled. The curved roof gleamed under the Oregon sun, restored piece by piece with care and memory. What had been a secret was now a sanctuary. Frank stood at the crest of the hill, watching a van pull up the gravel drive, its side marked Whitlock Veterans Memorial Home. The name still caught in his throat every time he read it. He'd chosen it not just for the captain, but for all of them, the men who had disappeared. The ones who never came home, the ones who had carried silence longer than anyone should. Ranger lay stretched on the porch nearby, his fur grayer around the muzzle. Now his breathing slower but steady. The old shepherd watched the van doors open, two volunteers stepping out to help a man on crutches, his uniform jacket worn thin but his eyes bright. "Morning," Sergeant Frank called, stepping forward to help. The man grinned. "Morning, sir. Hard to believe this place used to be falling apart." Frank smiled faintly. "You'd be surprised what can grow from something broken." Inside, sunlight spilled through the skylight onto the central hall. Where the spiral floor had once hidden secrets, a bronze plaque now caught the light. It read, "Freedom is worth the wait." He'd thought of those words one sleepless night, realizing every loss carried its own unbearable weight. The phrase was now carved into the stone itself, just above the spot where Ranger had first clawed at the ground, insisting there was something more beneath. The memorial had grown around that point, a perfect circle of purpose. Therapy rooms lined the curved walls, filled with soft light and voices learning to trust silence again. In the mornings, you could hear laughter from the garden behind the house where veterans grew herbs and flowers as part of their recovery program. Frank had insisted on that something that reminded them that life still grew in the soil of loss. He spent his days there not as a director, not even as a hero, but as a caretaker. The paperwork bored him, but the people didn't. He learned their names, their stories, their ghosts. Men who woke in the middle of the night hearing the sound of engines that weren't there. Women who carried medals in boxes they never opened. And slowly, under this round roof, they began to heal together. Ranger had become part of that healing. The staff called him the lieutenant. Whenever a new resident arrived nervous and guarded, Ranger would pad over, sit at their feet, and wait. Somehow, that quiet patience broke walls no therapy ever could. Even when his legs started to stiffen and his pace slowed, he refused to rest for long. Frank sometimes found him sleeping near the entrance as if still guarding the place he'd once uncovered. One afternoon, Frank found himself standing in the central hall. A group of visitors from the Veterans Association gathered nearby. One of them, a young officer barely 30, asked softly, "Is it true this house was built over buried treasure?" Frank smiled, looking down at the floor. "It's true, it was built over something valuable," he said. "But treasure isn't what you think it is." The officer nodded, glancing at the plaque. "Freedom is worth the wait," he read aloud. "That's different." Frank's voice was quiet. So was the man who built it. After the group left, he walked out onto the porch where the afternoon light stretched long across the fields. Ranger was lying in his usual spot chin, resting on his paws, watching the volunteers clean up tools by the fence. Frank sat beside him, the wood creaking softly beneath their combined weight. He rubbed the dog's head, feeling the rough fur under his hand. "You found it, boy," he murmured. "You heard what I couldn't." Ranger's tail thumped once, slow, deliberate. The sound of children's laughter floated from the garden, the scent of fresh bread from the kitchen carried on the wind. For a moment, Frank let himself really breathe, for the first time in years. The world no longer felt haunted. It felt built again from the same stones that once hid ghosts. He looked down at Ranger, whose eyes were half closed now, content but alert, the kind of peace that only comes after long duty. "We did good," Frank said softly. "You and me, we gave it back." The dog lifted his head slightly, ears twitching towards some sound in the distance, a truck coming up the road maybe, or just the wind. Frank smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said, "we'll keep watch." The sun dipped lower, casting the house in gold light. For the first time since he'd found that hatch, Frank felt the house breathe easy. It wasn't a vault anymore. It was alive. 5 years had passed since the first day sunlight touched the restored stone walls, and the round house that once slept under the weight of silence now breathed with life. Frank stood by the tall windows as evening light bathed the room in amber. The scent of coffee mingled with laughter echoing lightly through the hall. It was a quiet hour before dinner, the kind of peace that made even time slow its step. Across the room, a group of younger veterans practiced their physical therapy routines, some with braces, some with prosthetics, all with eyes that had seen too much and yet now dared to look forward again. Frank watched them the way a father might, his expression calm, proud, and still carrying that touch of disbelief that this place, once a vault of sorrow, had become a sanctuary of hope. Ranger lay nearby on the porch just outside the open doors. Half in the sun, half in shade, his muzzle silvered completely now. His breaths came slow and steady, the steady rhythm of a life lived long and well. Every so often, his tail would twitch when someone called his name, but mostly he slept content in his post as guardian of the peace he had helped uncover. Frank poured 2 cups of coffee out of habit, then paused, looking at the second cup with a small, knowing smile. He set it beside the old brass compass on the counter, a relic from Captain Whitlock's belongings he had found in the lower chamber years ago. The compass still pointed true north, but it was the inscription on its back that mattered. To serve quietly is to serve best. The captain's words, his final letter had become the heartbeat of this place. The veterans' home ran without pomp or ceremony, funded entirely by the gold that once lay hidden beneath their feet. None of the residents knew the full story. To them, the roundhouse was simply a gift, a home built by someone who understood what it meant to come back from war with invisible wounds. That was enough. Frank stepped outside, coffee steaming against the cool evening air. He leaned against the wooden railing and looked out over the hills. The trees swayed gently, their leaves catching the last gold of the sun. Ranger lifted his head ears, twitching eyes half-lidded but alert. "You still listening, old boy," Frank said softly. "Still keeping watch." The dog's tail thumped once, slow and deliberate. Frank chuckled under his breath and lowered himself onto the porch steps beside him. The years had softened him. His hair had thinned. His shoulders ached in the cold, but the fire in his chest still burned with quiet purpose. Behind them, laughter carried through the open doors, the veterans finishing their exercises, one of them teasing another about balance and stubbornness. The sound filled the air with warmth. Frank glanced toward the spiral of stone in the main hall where the bronze plaque gleamed faintly in the dying light. "Freedom is worth the wait." He whispered the words again, almost to himself. They had been the captain's creed. Now, they were his own. The wind picked up slightly, brushing across the porch. Somewhere beneath the floor, a soft vibration rose, a faint, hollow murmur, like the echo of a voice caught between the stones. It wasn't loud, not even clear, but it carried that deep, gravelly timbre Frank had heard once in a recording of Captain Whitlock. The sound lingered just long enough to resolve into an old magnetic recording on the house's intercom system. Words Whitlock must have left for whoever finished what he started. "Good job, son." Frank froze coffee forgotten in his hand. The air was still. Ranger's head-lifted eyes fixed on the open door as though he heard it too. Frank's lips curved slowly into a smile, the kind that came not from surprise, but from understanding. "Thank you, Captain," he said softly. The words drifted upward into the beams carried off by the same wind that had once rattled the broken shutters of this place. He stood, placed a hand gently on Ranger's back, and together they watched the light fade over the ridge. The dome above caught the last stretch of sunlight, scattering it across the curved walls until the whole house glowed faintly golden. It wasn't the shine of treasure, it was the reflection of peace, the kind that comes not from what's found, but from what's finally set free. Inside, one of the residents began playing a slow tune on the old piano notes, rising like prayers into the evening air. Frank closed his eyes, letting the music settle around him. Ranger shifted closer, resting his head against Frank's knee, his breathing a soft, steady hum. The world had grown smaller, simpler, kinder. The house no longer whispered secrets, it hummed with gratitude. As the sun sank behind the mountains, the last beam of light slid through the glass dome and landed squarely on the stone floor where the hatch once was. It shimmered briefly, a circle of gold, not metal, but sunlight. Frank watched it fade with a quiet sense of completion. The mission was over, but the story had chosen to keep breathing. Ranger's chest rose and fell like the tide. The same air that once carried a bark in the night now carried only calm. In the distance, a child's laughter from a visiting family echoed faintly across the yard, and somewhere beneath it, if one listened close enough, there was the soft rhythm of a dog's breathing, a sound steady enough to hold the world still for a moment. The house once built to guard a secret now guarded peace. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. It helps more people discover stories like this one. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Which moment stayed with you the most? And where in the world are you watching from tonight?